The storm had been brewing all evening, rolling in across the wide frontier like a dark beast with thunder in its chest. The wind whipped through the pines, rattled the shingles of an old cabin, and drove rain against the windows in heavy sheets. Inside that cabin, a single lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. A man sat by the fire, his hat tilted low, his face worn from years of silence. His name was Daniel Hayes, and for 5 long years he had lived alone, hidden away from the world. Nursing wounds no medicine could heal. Daniel had grown used to the quiet. The only sounds he knew were the crack of a log splitting in the fire, the mournful cry of coyotes out on the ridges, and the whisper of wind seeping through the gaps in the wood. He told himself he preferred it this way. No betrayals, no lies, just him and the land. But that night, something broke the silence. It came sudden, sharp, and desperate, a pounding on his door. Daniel froze, his hand hovering near the rifle that leaned against the chair. Nobody came out here. Nobody had for years. The storm howled outside, but over it he heard it again, a frantic knock, trembling with urgency. Slowly, with every instinct warning him to leave it unanswered, Daniel rose. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he crossed the room. When he pulled the latch and swung the door open, the storm itself seemed to spill inside wind. Rain, and a figure standing there, soaked to the bone, a young woman. Her hair plastered against her face, her eyes wide with fear, her lips quivering. She clutched at the doorframe as though it were the last thing keeping her alive. And then she whispered one word, so soft it nearly vanished into the storm: please. That single word was enough to shatter 5 years of silence. Long before the knock that shattered his solitude, Daniel Hayes had already been broken by the world. He wasn't always the hard, quiet figure he'd become. Once, he had been a young man full of light, working the ranches outside Red Rock, riding under open skies with laughter in his voice and hope in his heart. Folks said Daniel had a future brighter than the morning sun, and for a while, he believed them. He was in love with Clara, the town schoolteacher, a woman whose smile could stop him in his tracks. They spoke of a little white house, of children playing in the yard, of building a life together in the heart of the frontier. But dreams on the Wild West were fragile things, and Daniel's shattered overnight. Clara left him without warning, drawn away by the promise of wealth and comfort in the arms of a cattle baron, who could give her everything Daniel could not. On the table she left only a note, and the ring he had worked years to afford. That betrayal hollowed him out, and the man who once smiled at every neighbor rode out of town in silence, never to return. He built a cabin in the wilderness, deep among the whispering pines where no one would think to find him. For 5 long years, his world narrowed to the crackle of the fire, the creak of his horse's saddle, the bite of an axe splitting wood. He hunted beneath the endless sky, listened to coyotes cry beneath the silver moon, and carried on without speaking more than a handful of words in all that time. The land was his only companion, harsh, lonely, and faithful. In time, Daniel came to believe he needed nothing else. He was safe from betrayal, safe from the lies of people, safe from hope. But the silence he embraced so tightly was as merciless as the desert sun. And on one storm-dark night, that silence would come undone with the echo of a single knock. For a long while, the woman said nothing. She sat by the fire, her wet clothes steaming in the heat, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Daniel kept his distance, leaning against the doorframe, watching her like a hawk sizing up a stranger. He had lived too long in silence to welcome sudden company. Yet something in her trembling posture, in the way her eyes flickered toward the window as if she feared shadows lurking outside, told him this was no ordinary visitor. At last, she spoke. Her voice was soft, broken, the kind of voice worn thin by too many nights of crying in secret. Her name was Abigail. She had been married, or rather, forced into marriage to a man of wealth and cruelty. A man who treated her less like a wife and more like property to be controlled, displayed, or beaten when his temper flared. One night, she gathered the courage to slip away, leaving behind the suffocating walls of his house, the silk dresses that bound her, and the life that was slowly killing her spirit. She had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to be free. As her story spilled out, Daniel's chest tightened. He knew the type of man she spoke of. Men with money and power who believed the land, the cattle, and even people could be owned. Men who always got what they wanted, no matter the cost. Harboring Abigail could mean bringing that man's wrath down upon him. It could mean blood, fire, and the end of the quiet life he had built. And yet, loneliness pressed on him like the heavy snows of winter. 5 years he had lived without a voice to answer his own, without a soul to share the firelight. Still, he remembered betrayal all too well. Clara's ghost whispered in the back of his mind, warning him not to trust, not to feel, not to hope. So Daniel stood at a crossroads in his heart. Abigail's presence was a risk, a danger he could not ignore. But as she looked up at him, eyes glistening with fear and something like pleading faith, he felt the old walls of his solitude begin to crack. For the first time in 5 years, he had to decide whether to remain a prisoner of silence or risk everything. By letting another human being into his life, Daniel should have sent her away. Every instinct told him so. Yet when morning broke, he found himself splitting an extra log for the fire, laying out an extra plate at the table, and listening to the sound of Abigail's footsteps moving softly across the cabin floor. It was a strange feeling after 5 years of silence. The air was no longer empty. There was another voice to answer the crackle of the fire, another pair of hands to share the work. At first, the bond was born of necessity. Abigail cooked meals with what little they had, stirring beans over the fire while Daniel patched a leaky roof. She followed him to the pasture, helping mend a broken fence post with clumsy determination. He showed her how to lead his horse to water, how to gather kindling without getting her skirts caught on the brush. Nights were the hardest, yet the sweetest. After supper, they would sit outside the cabin and watch the stars wheel slowly above the dark ridges. Daniel spoke little, but Abigail filled the silence with quiet stories, tales of books she had read, of songs her mother used to sing. Sometimes, he even found himself answering Dot, and in those rare moments, Daniel felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he had buried deep, a memory of what it meant to share life with another soul. Companionship fragile, but real, but the frontier never let peace linger for long. On a supply trip into Red Rock, Daniel overheard whispers in the saloon. A woman had gone missing. A reward was posted. Her husband's men were combing the hills, their orders clear to bring her back, no matter who stood in the way. When Daniel returned to the cabin, the firelight flickered across Abigail's face, and for the first time in years, his heart ached with a question: would he run from trouble again, or finally take a stand? The night before the storm of men arrived, the cabin was heavy with silence. Daniel sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with steady hands, while Abigail paced the small room, her face pale in the glow of the fire. Outside, the wind carried a restless note, like the land itself was holding its breath. She tried to speak, but her voice broke before the words came. Finally, she whispered, "They'll kill you if you stand against him." Daniel looked up, his eyes steady, carved by years of solitude and loss. "Abigail," he said softly, "I've been dead inside for 5 years. If I let them take you back, I'll die all over again. I won't stand by." She wanted to beg, wanted to plead, but something in his tone silenced her. It was the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose except the one fragile piece of hope. She had brought back into his life. By dawn, the sound of hooves thundered across the plains. Dust rose on the horizon as half a dozen riders appeared, their silhouettes black against the morning sun. At their head rode her husband, his face twisted with arrogance and fury. He pulled up his horse and shouted across the valley, "Send her out, Hayes. She's mine by law and by right. Defy me, and I'll see you buried where you stand." Daniel stepped out from the porch, rifle in hand. His voice was calm, but it carried across the open land. "She's not yours. Not anymore." The standoff broke in an instant. Gunfire cracked like thunder, echoing off the ridges. Bullets tore into the cabin walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. Daniel dropped to one knee, firing with the precision of a man who knew every breath might be his last. Abigail crouched inside, hands trembling as she reloaded cartridges, passing them to him with tears streaking her cheeks. The fight raged through the morning light. 2 riders fell, groaning in the dirt. Another turned tail, spurring his horse hard into the distance. Still, her husband pressed forward, his pistol drawn, his rage unbroken. He aimed for Abigail, the shot already in his eye. But Daniel was faster. With a final pull of the trigger, he struck true. Her husband tumbled from his saddle, crashing into the dust. The echo of the shot lingered in the valley, then faded into silence. When the smoke cleared, Daniel stood trembling, his rifle slipping from his hands. He had faced death, and for the first time in years, he had chosen life not for himself, but for her. The valley lay quiet at last. Smoke drifted from the cabin roof where bullets had torn through the shingles, and the scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the morning air. Daniel staggered, his shoulder burning where a graze had torn his flesh. He pressed a hand to the wound, but his eyes were fixed not on the pain, nor on the bodies scattered across the dirt, but on Abigail. Standing in the doorway with tears shining in her eyes, the riders who survived were already fleeing, their horses kicking up dust as they vanished into the horizon. The cruel man who had once claimed her lay still in the dirt. His reign ended with a single crack of justice. The silence that followed was not the silence of solitude Daniel had known for years. It was the silence of peace, of battles won, of a new beginning waiting to be written. Abigail rushed to him, her hands trembling as she touched his face, as if to be sure he was real and not just some dream conjured by her desperate heart. Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time in 5 years, the walls around his soul gave way. The loneliness, the betrayal, the cold nights, with only the wind for company, all of it seemed to melt beneath the warmth of her presence. "You didn't just knock on my door," he whispered hoarsely. "You knocked on my heart, and I reckon I can't close it again." She smiled through her tears, and in that moment, two weary souls, one who had run from cruelty, the other from heartbreak, chose to stand together. No longer fugitives of the past, they became pioneers of hope, ready to carve a new life beneath the endless western sky. Now, dear listener, the story of Daniel Hayes and the woman who came knocking is not just a tale of the frontier, it's a question that reaches across time, straight to you. For 5 long years, Daniel lived in silence, his heart locked away, his soul buried beneath grief and betrayal. Then came a single knock, a stranger, soaked and desperate, asking for nothing but shelter. In that moment, he stood at a crossroads. He could have turned her away, kept his life quiet and untouched, but he didn't. He opened the door, and in doing so, he opened himself to risk, to pain, and to the possibility of love. So I ask you, if you were Daniel, what choice would you have made? Would you risk everything you had built, even your very life, for the chance to protect someone you hardly knew? Or would you have kept your heart shuttered, safe from harm, but empty forever? Share your thoughts below, because these stories are not only about the past, they are about us, about the choices we face, and the courage it takes to love when the world has taught us not to. What would you do? And so, the tale of Daniel Hayes and the runaway woman does not end with bullets or blood, but with something far more enduring: the truth that every human heart longs for a knock at the door. For years, Daniel believed silence was his salvation. He thought that shutting out the world was the only way to keep his pain from swallowing him whole. Yet in guarding his heart, he had also caged it, leaving it to wither in the shadows of loneliness. The frontier was a harsh teacher, and life in the Wild West offered no easy lessons. But even in that unforgiving land of dust and danger, it whispered the same truth we know today. Solitude may shield us from hurt, but it also starves us of love, hope, and meaning. Redemption doesn't always come in grand gestures, it often arrives quietly, like a knock on the door during a storm, asking us to take a chance. Daniel's story reminds us that courage and love ride side by side, and neither can exist without risk. To love is to fight, to open the door is to trust, and to trust is to live. Perhaps you, too, are waiting for that knock, an unexpected chance, a stranger, a choice that could change everything. When it comes, will you keep your door locked, or will you let it swing wide? Because sometimes, the greatest journeys don't begin on the trail. They begin at the door.